So we'll start off by reading the first 17 verses. Is there anybody that wants to open us up in, go ahead and read Exodus 20, verses 1 through 17?
Exodus 1 through 17?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth below, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I am the Lord your God, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's.
Exodus 20, 1 through 17, the Ten Commandments passage there. And we're just getting started with it. So, yeah.
Very cool.
As we're doing that. So one commentator said the big idea of this passage, he laid it out, is that the demands of holy living are much more exacting and far-reaching than we often assume. So can anybody tease that out a little bit? The demands of holy living are much more exacting and far-reaching than we often assume.
Well, I mean, when we're talking about holy living, we're talking about God's nature himself.
Mm-hmm.
And God being holy is perfection. And if you're asking imperfect beings to behave in a way that is perfect, you're asking more than they can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is kind of what the New Testament kind of picks up on, this idea that, that there is no way that man could actually fulfill all of the demands of the law. And that's why that justification is by faith. That's kind of Paul's point in Galatians and Romans and those famous passages from those epistles. But here we see this in the context of Israel's ratification with God and their covenant. So the ratification of the covenant with God and with Israel on Mount Sinai. So that's kind of the setting here. We've been reading Exodus all the way up to this point. In a way, like this is kind of like been building to this point, right? It's we're going to hit on this. They're kind of almost, when you think about it, they're building a society almost. Mm-hmm. They're about to go into a little ways from now. They're about to go into a land, establish their presence there, and really take up daily living, daily life, and establish a society with their God and with their people. But how might then, before we get into the commandments and actually looking at all of them and seeing this big idea play out through them, what might the context then play into? Like, what implications might it have on our interpretation of the text?
Well, the biggest one you can point out if you're reading this in chronological order is that this is really the first time God is really revealing himself in a personal way. Like, you've had God introduce himself as creator in Genesis, and he had a kind of relationship with Abraham, but you're not really learning about what God likes and doesn't like. It's kind of implied that we know that, but here it's clearly spelling it out in a really unique way. And I think the other really cool thing that you counter in this passage is that it's redefining Israel's relationship or identity as being in a relationship with God.
Yeah. And I think the other thing would just be the surrounding cultures, because I think that's one thing that's that just stands out so much when you're studying through Exodus and Leviticus, is that like it's such a stark contrast to all the other cultures,
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like sometimes I think when we look at these things from our context today, it's like, we hear certain things. It's like, oh, that sounds really sexist, or oh, that sounds like really harsh and stuff like that. Which I mean, there is stuff that's really harsh in them, but I think it's so it just stands so far above the other surrounding cultures and child sacrifice all around.
No, when you realize that's going on, it kind of frames things in a different light.
It's got these rules in there saying don't have sex with your mom and with your siblings and all this crazy stuff, and it's just like because it was like that was actually like oh, we didn't know that
issue.
And that kind of brings me to like this other kind of prompt here is, so this is a text just because like it has all those commands that it seems strange to us, like, well, yeah, like obviously, but all this stuff was going on, so it wasn't so obvious to them. And it kind of brings me to this other prompt here, and this kind of has to do with the context still, is this is a text that really wasn't written to us, because it was written to Israelites, but it was still written in a way that it's for us today. So what then, like, how should we deal with that? So I guess the one way is I'm asking how do they still apply to us today in a different way? Like, they're written to the Israelites, but it's for us, right? Indirectly, right? It is written to them, but for us today as God's word. This is inspired word. And so what do we do with that? How might that apply to us today? What?
Basically just ask what's the difference between the old and new
covenant.
I know.
Let's break it down to 5 minutes.
It's like, we still got a lot to go here. It's still like 2 pages.
I mean, there's definitely portions of it that are clearly cultural. Like this is like these laws that you're going to encounter past the Decalogue, past the 10 Commandments, are clearly aimed at what it means to be identified as a Jew in the day and age in which these proclamations were made, and which don't clearly transfer to today, like mixing different threads, not eating pork, like the amount of time that someone is considered unclean because they had sex or a woman is menstruating. I mean, all these things are not as clear as they used to be because it's more defined by the time and the culture which they were in then now. But there's other things that are very clear, like the timeless Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. Those are eternal. Like there's no way to get around that this is for all people for all time.
Sure. Yeah. And so if I could like summarize that in a way, I said I wasn't going to use the word here. So we got this Old Testament here. It's an inspired word of God. Just remember that too here in the background. So when we get Jesus, that's a big change, right? We said it's the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament was the question I asked me of us today. So some of those things that we see in the Old Testament kind of run into the New Covenant, and they kind of stop here. Others, they go through and they come out and they it's still the same thing, but there's like a new perspective to it, and there's a new bent on it. And then there's those other things here, primarily like a lot of what we're going to read today in the Decalogue, that kind of just goes right through, and it's basically the same thing. Yeah, and so I saw that's not like my own. That was an illustration one of my teachers gave me one day. And I just thought that was really helpful, that some of the stuff we read, it kind of ends with the New Covenant, and other stuff doesn't end, but it kind of, it's reconceptualized. And then there's other stuff that's just that timeless truth that just kind of keeps going. And for those who are online that can't see that, I apologize, who are maybe watching this in the future, or Ray and Shay who are on right now. And we see that in the first commandment, right? Do not have any other gods besides me. That's not going to change. That's going to stay forever and forever the same. And so that kind of brings us to the nature of the 10 Commandments. And so what do we often think of the 10 Commandments in a general sense? altogether.
What do you
Yeah.
You are kind of like, so do we think of them as laws? How do we
So like the like
Yeah.
building blocks of
Yeah.
like the whole culture, like
Yeah.
these are this, these are
Yeah.
the foundational
So
It's like
principles.
moral law.
okay, so I'll put it. Yeah, I'll put it this way. Do we think of them as laws, or should we think of them as laws or broad principles? Maybe if we can maybe rephrase that, but I'll just put that dichotomy out there.
Which one?
I mean, for most of my, like for most of the education that I've ever encountered, like especially as a kid, it was like, these are laws. Like these are things you have to do.
Yeah.
But as I've grown up and matured in the faith, I've started to understand that these are grounding principles that everything is kind of framed upon.
Mm-hmm.
So like if I can use architecture as an analogy here, these are the footing upon which the rest of the law you read about is built upon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd agree with that. And so it's interesting because we call them like the 10 Commandments and everything like that, and that comes from like we often hear it called like the Torah, something which we always see translated as commandment, but actually it's maybe better translated as instruction.
Mhm.
And in fact, later on in the same book in Exodus, in chapter 34, in the title that's actually given to them, they're not called commandments. They're actually called the 10 words.
Mm.
They're not really ever called laws like we think of like case law today.
Mhm.
But they're moral truths, they're moral realities, or moral guidelines or precepts that we should be kind of instilling as the bedrock of our foundation. And
Yeah, but
Yeah.
why? I mean, because like,
Yeah.
not that I don't
Yeah.
know, but it's like, that's the biggest question. Like, like we build this as a foundation for everything,
Yeah.
but like, why is this the foundation?
yeah, well, why do you? I mean, just turn it.
I mean, for me, I've always encountered it this way and explained it this way, that God, we have a relationship with God, and
Mhm.
just like I have a relationship with my wife,
Yeah.
there's things that I know that if I do them, they'll please her, and things that if I don't do, and things that if I don't do will also make her upset.
Yeah.
And so God's clearly letting us know who He is,
Mm-hmm.
so that we can clearly have a good relationship with Him. Like, if we hurt our relationship with each other, which is what you see in the second half of the 10 Commandments, that's going to upset God.
Mm-hmm.
Just as much as if we neglect or take our relationship with Him lightly,
Mm-hmm.
is going to hurt Him.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's about how we interact with Him and the creation that He's made, that He's giving us this.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Like a value system
Yeah.
through which to see the world.
Yeah. And it's not just, it's not just like this cosmic, I don't know, my old pastor I thought it was so corny, he used to say, God's not a cosmic killjoy. So it's not like it's only just for us and God, or because He, like, this is how He wants us to go, but it's also for our good too, right? And we'll see that also in how these commandments sort of break down. Let's just, as a test, we don't need to write it down. Without trying to look at your Bibles, can we name the 10 Commandments?
Yeah.
Let's go.
No other gods.
No other gods.
No idols.
No.
Don't take the Lord's name in vain.
Mm-hmm.
Remember the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
Honor your father and mother.
Don't steal. Don't want other people's stuff. Don't other people's
Murder.
wives. Don't murder.
Don't
And
Don't lie.
Don't lie.
No.
Okay.
Very
Yeah.
false witness. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Don't bear false witness. Yeah. So those are all the 10. Now, one thing to cover, and you said this actually, and you hit on it. These actually have a unique kind of status in the book. That these are proclaimed directly by God. They're not like actually like mediated through Moses, like we often see throughout the book of Exodus and everything. No, this is actually God speaking, or at least reported as God speaking to the people, right? And so this is
writing in the tablets.
yeah, and they're inscribed with the finger of God is the language used in chapter 31. So so these are very much unique. Like this is like everything should be screaming at us like this is different. Like this should this should pull us in. And so we see in the introduction then, like that was all to get to here in verse 1, where then God says, then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. One of the things that we kind of miss in some of our translations is we don't have a singular your or a plural your. There's kind of both. But where he says, I am the Lord your God, it's actually uniquely in the singular. And it's in the singular throughout the passage. And most people think that's because God is also addressing them as the whole people, yes, but and addressing as each one with the recognition that they're individuals here. And so there is a communal aspect to it, but there is this expression that every individual has the part to play in this. Every individual has to keep these commandments. Every individual has to abide by these in order for this to work, for this covenant to work, for God, for Israel to be God's people. And that kind of brings the introduction to the 10 Commandments. And it's based on the motivation for it is who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. And there's a lot of things we can get into in that. Mainly so what, I'll ask it this way. So again, this kind of comes to it was written to Israel, but it still has relevance to us. So what we would do with that, right? This was written to God, and it looks as if this is motivated because he brought them out of the land of Egypt. He brought them out of slavery. He redeemed them. And kind of like, how should we understand that today, right? We understand it's pretty straightforward, right? He redeemed them. He's the one who led them out of Israel. He's the one that freed them from Egypt. And this is why he's giving them these commandments, because he wants them to be his people. So what does that mean for us today?
My own personal take is that God's starting with, I want to have a relationship with you. I have actively done things to pursue a relationship with you and seek out the best for you. Yeah. And so I would I'd love to have this relationship returned back to me. So like we both have a relationship with each other. And so let me remind you of who I am for you. And so here's this, so you can have that relationship returned. So back to that.
Yeah. I mean,
I feel like it's also just like a constant reminder of like the Israelites couldn't get themselves out of slavery. Like they could have tried to revolt and like start a war or whatever, but like they were helpless in their slavery. And so like just that constant reminder of like, it wasn't like the Israelites could have just left Egypt, magically crossed the Red Sea by themselves and killed all the Egyptians by themselves and then been here and been like, yeah, I think maybe God's a cool idea. Like just
so you're focusing on like God is so powerful kind of aspect of it.
No, I was just saying like just that constant reminder that like it wasn't just us being okay and deciding to follow God. It was that God had to step in and save us because we couldn't save ourselves.
I like that. Yeah.
And I mean, were we saved? Were we redeemed from anything?
Oh, don't open up that door.
But I want to open it at least a little bit because we see a lot of the same imagery show up again in the New Testament, right? Like there is a lot of this, there is this idea of God redeeming his people, right? Jesus paying a ransom, as he says in Mark 10, this freeing from slavery, the slavery to sin and everything like that. And so there is this kind of like, this recast of this relationship, and God redeemed Israel from Egypt, and he's also redeemed us from the tyranny of sin, from our sin nature, from a slavery that we couldn't escape on our own too. And it kind of gets cast, the New Testament kind of gets cast this as like a new Exodus and everything like that. And so that's kind of all in the background. And in that too, we see much of these same commands show up again. Right. I mean, there's obviously throughout the New Testament, there are commands of worshiping God alone and not any other gods. Right. I mean, I feel like that's pretty straightforward,
especially in the temptation of Christ.
Yeah. And so this still has relevance to us, even though we see that like, oh, well, he brought them out of Egypt. He didn't bring me out of Egypt. I guess this has no relevance. No, it still has immense relevance to us today.
Yeah, and I think also it's sort of an order of actions as well, because it's because I did this for you,
Mhm.
here's what I want you to do.
Yeah.
It's like a great leadership principle. Like,
Mhm.
hey, I did this first.
Yeah.
You guys follow me. Look what look what I
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm laying
Mhm.
this groundwork for you guys.
Absolutely. And so then the structure of the commandments here, we probably all have heard it before. The first 4 are God focused, and then 5 through 10 are man focused or relational, societally focused. Might be a better way of putting it, because it's not like, I don't know, man focused kind of has a negative connotation that might come up. But yeah, so the first command is, not having any other gods. This is really short before it gets to the next one, but I want to key in this language of not having other gods besides me.
Mhm.
Can we think of some other terms that are used in all right, so don't go after idols.
Mhm.
Don't, can anybody think of any other ideas where this kind of shows up? There's a point here where trying to think, don't go after idols. Should have wrote these down, but there's other times where I think you're tracking with me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think the best way to kind of zoom in on what you're talking about is how Jesus himself kind of summed up the first 4
Mhm.
in that love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength.
Mhm.
And so if there's anything that your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength are yearning after that
Mhm.
isn't God, then you
Yeah.
have lost sight and you're not worshiping him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that is, and to build on that, this idea of having actually, because don't serve idols, don't go after idols. There's some other stronger imagery that I'm trying not to say that is used of Israel and later in the prophets. They played the harlot and went after idols and stuff like that. This idea of having is actually said to be more basic and actually evidence of a foundational sort of document, right? It's not dressed up in more specific language, I should say. It's general. It's don't have these other gods, and it's actually support for in another way of talking about how it's so different than the other culture is that you are not to have any other god besides me. This is ruling out off the cuff polytheism, any sort of idea of what's called henotheism. You have one god, but you have all these other gods here too. No, they're not supposed to have any other gods. Those aren't actual gods. It's just the one God. And so that's kind of the idea that's coming in here. So it is actually affirming that, they do believe they are actually monotheistic, which some people will want to debate, but this is actually kind of evidence that no, they were monotheistic actually.
I think one thing that I've come to understand about this passage in recent years is how important God is trying to make himself in our lives. It's not that he isn't important, he's trying to identify him there, but he already is that important and he already needs to be in that place for our lives to operate in the best way God designed us to be. And so unless we're identifying him as our sole source for everything, we're going to be lacking in some way. And I think that's one way that we should definitely be looking at this passage.
Yeah. Anything else building on that? We'll move to command number 2.
I think just what kind of going off what you said about the no other gods at all is just, even in a today current application is the way that we Americanize Christianity. Oftentimes think of okay, try to put God as number 1 on the totem pole kind of thing. But this radical idea of no, we're actually not supposed to be worshiping anything but God. That's probably if we all looked into our hearts, we've all got something that we're worshiping here and there, or something that is a little g God in our lives, but
and so that's kind of a new way of spinning it. It's maybe it's not we believe in the sun god over here that gives us sunlight, but we believe in I don't know, just to pick on myself, the football god over
Tom
here.
Brady.
Cleveland Browns making the Super Bowl would be much more.
One day.
Yeah. So just to pick on myself with that. Yeah. You know, like, you get like these.
Would his idol be the goat?
Yeah. Some of my friends probably have that made somewhere on there. Yeah. So that goes us to reflect inwardly, right? Like, yeah, no, we don't have like a sun god or a god of rain or anything like that, but we might have some other god that's in our life that we need to root out and pick out and everything. And that kind of goes into the next commandment, right? Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow and worship to them and do not serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the father's iniquity to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, this commandment has sparked like some pretty actual intense debate, and if you don't know it, you're actually probably better off for it. With the idolatry and like images, and whether or not we should have like images of like the cross of Jesus or like anything like that. And so I don't really want to get into that. But anybody else have anything like have something that they want to like say about it? And we can always of course like actually get into it. But I kind of like summarize this as like a command against making an idol with the intention of becoming subservient to it. Yeah, is there anything to build on that? Say otherwise? You look like you're about to say something, Joanne.
I think for me, since like we don't live in a culture that, you know, actually carves anything and then puts it on a pedestal, and
Yeah,
we don't, you know, there are cultures who still do that, and it has bled somewhat into the American culture, but in general, that's not something that we encounter.
yeah,
I always think of when I come to this passage of when we alter the image of Christ and worship that.
yeah,
When it's like for example, because I used to work at a Christian bookstore, I saw this all the time, where it was people would come in raving about a certain devotional or something like that, and it would be all that they read. Like never open up the Bible, but just read the devotional because they liked that Jesus that was in the devotional. And so like when we raise up this image of amen. But anyways, yes. But
she's been hitting that hard lately. Yeah.
We were my wife. I was just about wife. We were talking about that a couple months ago.
But you know, and so like we create this image of Christ that we then worship when it's not this Christ.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've been teaching kids lately is like the nature of God. We started with He is whole, and the definition we simplified enough to make it so kids can understand is that God is perfect and good, but different. And that different thing is something to really latch on here, especially when it comes to context with idols, because there's the carved nature of things, but there's also the nature of the image that we also use in our own heads. And so one of the things that's really hard not to do is to humanize God without using Jesus as your context for that human.
The first time I ever heard the image debate, it was in Knowing God by J.I. Packer.
Yeah.
There's a whole chapter on it, and
he hits on it hard. Yeah.
I don't know if I agree with him to that full extent, but it was the first time I'd ever really thought about it. I was like, oh man, like
No, I've never thought about it before.
images in terms of like depictions of Christ.
Yeah,
or like
yeah,
a lot of
yeah.
people hold, depictions of like it's wrong anytime to try to depict God himself. Outside of Christ in the flesh or something, because that can immediately create a false perception of God in your head.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Definitely reevaluates a lot of children's material and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Is this wrong?
Yeah, and I know the debates. I know the debates in the early church. Don't want to get too deep into this. Like I read a little bit on it one day. It actually came to head, like I think it was John of Damascus who argued, like we're not like making depictions of God the Father because he wasn't incarnated, right? Like Jesus Christ, the God the Son, and becoming incarnated allows us to make images of him because he himself was an image. He was the image of the invisible God.
Right, yeah.
And so like when I like balancing that with J.I. Packer's kind of like adamantly like no go, like no images whatsoever. Like I think there's like a balance somewhere in there to be kind of had with that. I don't go ahead. Yeah.
Oh no, I was just gonna say that I think probably like the more productive application for us like today is just sort of like evaluating the actual idols in our hearts that are pulling us away from God. And, but yeah.
Yeah, and then that goes back to like like also in a similar way, right? Like the false gods that we create in our own hearts as well too. But does anybody have a problem with the whole I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God? Okay. Does that like not like make anybody like the least bit uncomfortable?
I mean,
Totally fine with it.
I think we're all good here, but
Okay, all right, yeah.
if you want to touch on it for somebody who's watching it later, we might.
Yeah. Well, like the reason why is because so if you like I don't know, like to me like that was like oh man I don't know because we always think jealousy is negative, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
we don't think
Selfish.
of it as selfish. It's jealousy is inherently like self-centered. They want that thing for themselves. The word that's actually like used here, just like a little nugget here, in the Greek. So there is a Greek Old Testament and there is actually a Hebrew Old Testament. And the Greek actually like bears it out really well that a better translation actually might be zealous because it's literally zealotes is the Greek word. So we can kind of see zealous from that. And he is like has this zealousness, he has this passionate loyalty for his creation, in a sense. And so maybe it kind of helps it like if anybody ever watches this later, maybe Ray, who's been pretty quiet, it's not this self-centeredness. I think we all get that. Go ahead. Yeah.
I like don't agree with that
Yeah.
because why would him just being like, oh, I'm zealous, by the way, doesn't fit into the context of what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And him being jealous, we are not allowed to be jealous because when we're jealous, we are craving the attention or something like that, which is something that we as fallen, sinful human beings don't deserve.
Sure.
So when we do it, we are in the wrong.
Yeah.
But when he does it, he has every single right to be jealous for our worship and our time and attention because he deserves it.
Yeah.
That's why I love the zealous way of defining it, because the best way for me, I've always looked at it, is like God has the most perfect self-esteem there is. He truly understands who he is. He understands his identity. And because he really knows who he is, he also knows what is owed to him and what he's worth. And so he knows that there's nothing else worthy of the attention and focus of anyone's time other than him.
And I think I wouldn't say like what I said and what Joanna said, what Jonathan said is like are inherently at odds with each other. Like, and because we kind of get into that here too, like and I was going to actually like ask too if anybody was following with the language here, punishing the children for the father's iniquity to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me.
I do. I mean, I've had a theological question for that for like a while now.
So
it doesn't seem like to us our sense of justice like that. That seems wrong.
The way like the best thing I think there is for this kind of thing is in Genesis 14, I believe it is. Abraham is not allowed to go to the land yet, and he's not allowed to go to the land basically for one reason. It's the iniquity of the Canaanites is not yet completed. It's not yet filled up. And so God is so patient that, and we'll get into this here, and there's a really great way to put this so you know that the children aren't being unjustly punished for the father's sins here, is that sin is generationally going on. And God is so patient that eventually it comes to this place where it's filled up. And he has to be a just God as well too. This is where we're balancing the attributes of God here,
Yeah.
and where he has to have judgment, where judgment has been merited and shown forth.
Yeah.
But those who show, sorry, and I'll let you talk. Yeah.
I'm just really excited to say it, so keep going, keep going.
But showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. If somebody's father sinned and the son repents of his sin and devotes himself to the Lord,
Mhm.
do we think for 1 second God is going to punish that person?
No.
I mean, there might be, and I'm not saying he's going to have a perfect life or he's not having anything go wrong or any maybe consequences go on there, but are we going to say that God is going to punish that person for his iniquity? Of course not. Of course not.
Yeah, kind of like Hezekiah would be an example. His father was like literally the worst out of all of the kings of Israel. And then Hezekiah is like, tries to bring about all this reform and everything.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so we see that in the king's story. What were you about to say?
Yeah, well, I mean, the other thing about sin is that it's not just spiritual, it's physical.
Mm-hmm.
All of creation failed, not just our spiritual lives, but our spiritual life, physical lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of people, when they hear about this punishing children, they're just focusing on the spiritual nature of sin,
Mm-hmm.
which is like, I committed sin, and so I should take the brunt of the responsibility here. But because sin has a physical nature too, just like we pass down traits to our children, this sin nature is also being transferred onto the children as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
Sort of like the consequential effects of this hurts people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's like so it's like I have sin in my life, and because I'm a sinful human, I'm going to make another sinful human because that's all I can make, and that curse is going to get passed along.
Mm-hmm.
But the beautiful thing is that Christ came so that even though I have that sin, and even though I pass it on, my children and my children's children can turn to Christ to take the place of the punishment that they deserve.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just have a textual question of what does visiting the iniquity mean?
That is a good question. Does it say visiting the children for the father's iniquity, or visiting what?
It says visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children.
Okay.
So visiting the
Gotcha.
iniquity, that's not a phrase we use.
So I wish I had a good answer for this. The CSB says punishing the children for the father's iniquity.
That's what I have.
What translation do you have?
Old NIV.
Old NIV. Okay. So I'm guessing then, I don't know this off the top of my head. I'm guessing the ESV is probably more literal here, and the CSB and NIV is like an interpretation of that, and that the visiting is this idea of coming to visit somebody for punishment or for judgment. That's what I would guess off the cuff, not having the text in front of me. Because I'm sure Joanna would love to hear me talk about Hebrew grammar.
Just don't hear me talk about it enough.
But let's keep going here to the third commandment. So it's only 7:24.
Oh no!
So I want somebody else to read the ESV if you don't mind, because verse 7. Yeah.
You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain.
All right. So, is this a commandment against saying, just as an example, oh my God? What is it a commandment against?
I think it's the idea behind saying something like that.
What do you mean the idea?
Well, I mean, especially if you're going to use it in a flippant situation, there are situations where something horrible is happening and you're invoking the name of the Lord because only he in the situation could ever improve it. But the idea that God and who he is, his nature is so important that he isn't to be taken lightly in any way. I mean, it's not like saying that we can't make jokes or anything like that, but it is saying that how respectfully, how serious is God to you? How real is he to you? This is the creator of the entire universe we're talking about here. So he deserves respect. Are you really giving him the respect he deserves? Or are you just going to take his name and use it flippantly as an expletive in some form or fashion?
Yeah. So yes, I would not disagree with that. I do want to add something else to that, a different element here. So the CSB adds or says it, do not misuse the name of the Lord your God,
Mhm.
because the Lord your God, the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses his name. So this actually goes beyond simple expressions like, oh my God, or Jesus Christ, things like that, where we're kind of saying it typically, traditionally, in saying the Lord's name in vain, right? This actually has a commandment against promoting your own agenda in the name of God.
Mhm.
So, like, I mean,
Whew.
yeah. So just to take a radical example. out
David's
there.
fault.
So take a radical example, Westboro Baptist Church,
Mhm.
right? Who you invoke the name of Jesus Christ and all the hate that they do and everything like that. That I think is a very great example of what the commandment is actually against misusing the Lord's name, co-opting the Lord, because we're not just taking the Lord's name here, we're taking everything, like his character, everything he's about, and we're attaching it to our agenda, our motivations, what we want to see accomplished in the world. And if those things aren't right, if that what my motivations are and what God's motivations are, and I take God's name and say he's doing what my motivations are, like that's a very scary place to be in. So yeah, just
it's interesting because I mean, even just for myself personally, I've actually never made that connection before in that way, but I think that's definitely accurate. I mean, nothing makes me more upset than like seeing stuff like Westboro Baptist Church or like people storming the Capitol with Jesus, Jesus stuff like that. And it's like, this is so contrary to who this is. And the reason it makes me like, I would be way more upset about that than like just someone else just doing like, some of that stuff. Because in my, like, the reality is like, they're literally just dragging Jesus through the mud because that's not who he is. That is not his character.
They're just name dropping him.
Yeah. And if you've seen Christianity Today's articles anytime soon, you also know somebody else who might have been doing the same thing. So yeah.
I was just gonna say the best way I ever heard this verse kind of explained was back in this day and age, people went out under the name of their God. Like people, like every single nation always had their God, and they went out as the men of Baal or whatever. Like they always represented their God whenever they did something. And so God is addressing that, and they're like, you are now my people. So when you do something, it represents me. And so whatever you're doing, you better make sure it aligns with my character.
Yeah.
And so like with that, like if we're going to claim to be Christians, if we're going to use that to describe ourselves, we better make sure our character aligns with that. And so like beyond that of just like everything we do, people are watching and we're taking Jesus with us. So like, are you okay with your behaviors being representative of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, just brought to mind the story in Judges, or is it Samuel, where the Ark of the Covenant is brought out before they go into battle, and God lets them loose, and they lose Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
Where it's like, oh, you don't get to represent me anymore because you did a bad job.
And that's why I think the punishment, right? Like it's just like, the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses his name. Like that's why I think that's just so stern there, is because of what it actually, like what it means, right? Like what he's really communicating. Now this was kind of like more narrowly applied even in Jewish cultures too, as well, like just saying Yahweh, right? That's why, like, or I don't know if this is exactly why, but it probably is in some way indirectly related, is that's why, you don't ever hear a Jew say Yahweh, you hear them say like Adonai or something like that. Whenever, like they don't say the divine name. That's why that you have these kinds of things.
Or like I think it was church fathers or monks who like they would change out the pen every time they wrote the word Yahweh, which is, I mean, I think is kind of sad that we don't have today that same level of reverence for like the name of God.
But in some cases, is that really reverence, or is it just you creating a religious barrier between actually having a relationship with him and just saying, I identify him as great and holy, but not really knowing him.
Yeah, I think it's a fine line, right?
Yeah,
I think both are possible. I think, you don't want to be, again, you don't want to be flippant with things, right? Like you do want to have a certain amount of reverence, but then there is that kind of like, pietistic attitude that can just be like, that can just be a barrier in and of itself too. And so I think that's
What does changing out the pen become a distraction from who the pen was writing about?
yeah. And I think that's like, I think that would be like an individual thing, right? Like
Mhm.
where is your heart at in that ordeal, in that situation? That's where I think I would kind of stand on things like that. Because I know for me, I'm not a Catholic by any stretch of the imagination, but I absolutely love the way they conduct the Lord's Supper with the reverence that they do it, that they have when they're doing it. I've said that a lot, and I'll end up saying it again. I don't agree with all the theology, and that's why I'm at a Baptist church. But I can still say I like the reverence, I like the respect that they have in that.
Because the other side of the coin would be Christ's use of, Abba Father,
Yeah.
super intimate,
Yeah.
personal
Yeah.
language.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the fourth commandment, keeping the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, or your male or female servant, your livestock, or the resident alien who is within your city gates. For the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything in them in 6 days. Then he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it, holy. So, what do we think of this one?
A lot.
Yeah, I definitely have a question.
Yeah.
Well, not really a question, but sort of like just the extent of this, because we don't need to be legalistic, but like I was in ministry for several years, and kind of use this verse specifically to call out people who are just working 7 days a week, and that's one of those things where it's like, is it like, if and my wife and I recently, we try to be pretty strict with having a day of rest, which on one hand is just simply like, a law of nature, like it's beneficial and good to make sure, to have a day out of 7 days where you're resting. But in terms of like, this kind of goes to that diagram on the board there, like, is this, one of those things that we should really keep to the letter and like really have, are we in disobedience if we go 14 days without a day of rest or something?
Yeah, and there's a heated debate on that too, right? Like we have a friend who's a Sabbatarian who rests. There's people that are very strict about it. That you need to keep it. I do have a personal opinion on it. I think it's one of those things that curves up there and changes direction. And the reason I think that is because of the book of Hebrews. I think that Jesus becomes our Sabbath rest. That we have our Sabbath rest in Him. And I would just because of the time, I'd say read Hebrews 4. It's like 3 and 4. It's a really, really cool thing to think about. And a lot of people have written on this too. That as when Christ comes and we are brought into Him and into that new covenant, we have that eternal rest. Now that does not change that having a day of rest is a good principle, right? Because again, these are good guys. These are not like going to change just because of the day has changed, right? Always having a day of rest is very important. It is important to have rest.
And again, like we said earlier about sin being not just spiritual but physical, but also having a relationship with God has its physical and spiritual aspects too as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and also there's actually some precursors of this too. They were actually to have that rest for the manna in chapter 16. And this actually kind of becomes the sign of the covenant later on in chapter 31 and 35. And that's why some people also believe too, since it was the sign of the Sinaitic covenant, that the covenant at Sinai, this covenant, that it kind of goes away with the new covenant. So that might be something else to kind of think about there too as well.
Wait, sorry, is that last sentence?
Yeah, so later on in chapters 31 and 35, there's a little bit of a discussion. It's 31, 12 through 17, and 35, 1 through 4, where it seems that the Sinaitic covenant the sign of the Sinai covenant is the Sabbath rest. And it's also said in Deuteronomy too, instead of this explanation of the Lord made all the heavens and the earth in 6 days, right? He redeemed you out of Egypt, and it's still the Sabbath rest, as he says in Deuteronomy. Yeah, and so I really like Genesis 1 through 11, so I really kind of like went down a little bit of a rabbit hole with the whole creation thing, which I wish I had more time to think about. Technically, we're actually like already over our time here. So I'll summarize it this, right? So we've covered a little at some length commandments 1 through 4, right? So the divine human focus, and that's all that matters anyway. Just kidding. So the societal focus one, and we see here, right? These are actually very short, where there's some lengthy description of the other commandments, right? You have honor your father and mother so that you may have long life. So there's a promise there, right? In the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And then we have, just rattle off quickly, don't murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony against your neighbor, do not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, his female or male servant, his ox or a donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And so you just kind of rattles these off pretty quickly here. There's some different schools of thought that I didn't really get into with that. So I'm not sure exactly why, admittedly. I would like to know if anybody knows. Please tell me. But just some theological insights, and I'll try to wrap it in a bow, especially with the 5 through 10, since we didn't talk about these. Right, some theological insights from this. I think that Yahweh is the ultimate authority here, and he is the ultimate arbiter of what is moral. And I think that he is the arbiter of that because he is morality, he is goodness, and everything he does is also good and right and righteous. And building on that, the 10 Commandments underline God's uniqueness as supreme moral authority over all of his creation. And number 3, to worship an inferior substitute God is to deny the incomparable supremacy of the Lord, of Yahweh, of God. It inevitably is secondary. It's not good enough. It's not right for establishing that community. And I just want to end on that note, end with Deuteronomy 6. And we don't read this enough.
The Bible or Deuteronomy?
Both. We always think of the Shema, if you know what that is, in Deuteronomy 6:4. But what comes after that is just beautiful, and I think just really lost on instilling that society and that foundation, what it means to attempt to do that. And I'll just start in verse 4. Listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These words that I'm giving you today are to be in your heart. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them be a symbol on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your city gates. That is just so... It's just so lost on us today, that practice of just being totally surrounded by the word of the Lord, by just being completely immersed into it. And right before this too, in chapter 5, Moses actually goes back through the 10 Commandments again. So these are definitely very connected, right? He does give more commandments afterwards, but I think in mind, he has these commandments here that they're supposed to not just keep them for themselves, they're supposed to repeat them to their children. There's an educational practice in mind to that they're supposed to pass on these moral truths to their children. And they're supposed to talk about them when you're at your house. You're doing this in your house. When you walk along the road, whenever you're out going around, you're supposed to talk about this with presumably other people. When you lie down, or when you get up, put them on a sign in your hand so that people see them when they see you. Put it on your doorpost in your house and on your city gates, so that people know when they come on your property and when they come to the city limits, right, that they see this. And this is just so lost on, being just surrounded and immersed in it, and that really creates that bedrock for society when you have God's word and His commands and His will for you written down like that. That you start to actually, I don't know, maybe do those things that He has commanded you to do. I don't know if anybody has anything to add before we close.
No, you covered it brilliantly.
Does anybody want to say this after? Or should I? Okay. Lord God, thank you for this lesson. Thank you for your word, God, and your commands, and just that you want what is best for us. And Lord, forgive us for, I don't know, running around, ignoring you, not following you, not listening to you, not heeding your word. And give us the right mind and right heart and right spirit so that we might do what you've commanded us to do. And thank you for what you have given us in your Son and the Holy Spirit, so that we might listen to instructions. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
We praise the Lord for Jim and his study this week as he led the discussion. We're thankful to him for doing so. I look forward to being back with everyone next week as we dive back into Exodus to continue our study in the commandments. I pray that God's face would shine upon you and His countenance be with you. And until next time, remember, God loves you, and so do I.